What would you do if the person who hurt your wife thought he was untouchable? This is not just a story of betrayal. It's a story of boundaries, justice, and consequences that refuse to fade. Tonight, you'll hear how one man turned silence into strength and how a single bruise changed everything. You're watching Cheating Stories 7. If you enjoy these powerful stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. It helps us bring you more gripping tales. So now, let's step into this story. He bruised my wife. I rewrote the rules and made consequences last. Elena Park's key turns in the lock with a hesitation Mason has never heard. The click is the same as the last 6 years, but tonight it carries a brittle edge, as if even the door feels her weight. She steps inside with a careful smile that asks not to be studied. Mason, at the kitchen table with invoices spread like a puzzle, catches the detail immediately. Her walk is stiff, measured. He rises, reading strain where her blouse folds at the shoulder. A scent trails behind her, sharp, masculine, unfamiliar in their house. The leather purse lands on the counter more gently than necessary, set down as if sound itself could break. Her fingers linger on the strap, her hands rehearsing a choreography meant to look ordinary. Mason does not accuse, he observes. Years restoring fragile structures have trained him to see stress lines before collapse, a hairline crack in brick, a bow in timber, a tremor opening in plaster. Tonight, every gesture whispers of a force she will not name. "You're late," he says, gentle, sanding the edge off the words. "Traffic," she answers too quickly. Her voice lacks its usual lift. She slips off her heels, one and then the other, and tucks them beneath the bench like a soldier stowing evidence. Dinner cooled an hour ago. He reheats a plate without comment, sets it in front of her, and watches steam curl between them. She eats in small motions, eyes skimming everywhere but his. The silence stretches, not hostile, just dense with facts left unsaid. She reaches for her water and her body betrays her. A wince flashes and is gone, the kind of pain that arrives before a person decides to feel it. Mason sees it. He always sees what others miss. "You okay?" he asks. Another smile, brighter, brittle. "Just a long day, don't worry." She redirects toward safe ground, bills, a coworker's promotion, a recipe her sister texted. He plays along, but his attention circles back to the flinch, the scent, the way she set the purse down like glass. Later, while they fold laundry, he lingers in the doorway and watches the precise, mechanical way she aligns sleeves, stacks cotton, squares corners. The unfamiliar cologne still hovers in the room, faint as a warning. He does not press. He stores details the way he stores measurements of sagging beams and the slow, exact math of load and span. That night, lying awake, he listens to Elena's breathing settle into an uneasy rhythm. The question forms in the dark, fragile, insistent, refusing to be filed away. It is not jealous, jealousy imagines. This is structural, a sense that weight has shifted somewhere in the frame they live inside. He thinks about thresholds, how many footsteps it takes to wear a finish thin, how many seasons before a seam goes rigid and stops forgiving small misalignments, how a fracture once seen will keep shining at the edge of the eye until someone names it. Near midnight, she turns and burrows closer, and he cannot tell if the movement is habit or shield. He lays a hand above the quilt, not touching her, measuring the space the way he would measure clearance before cutting. He remembers a courthouse cornice he once saved, clean paint hiding rotten wood, a proud face masking hollow. The danger was not the visible. It was the sound, the hollow knock that told the truth. He closes his eyes and lets the kitchen replay, the careful smile, the careful purse, the careful plate gone cool. Careful is a kind of alarm when it replaces ordinary. It is small now, the doubt, no more than a line too fine for strangers to notice. But he knows what small lines become if ignored. The load shifts by ounces, then pounds, and one day the span demands more than the beam can carry. In the quiet, he gives the question its first accurate name. Not what happened tonight, not who, something simpler, heavier. What changed in the foundation? And once you have seen a crack, you do not unsee it. The morning air at Denver's Union Station site carried the cool bite of early spring, dust lifting where beams cut sunlight into shafts. Mason Cole stood with his crew, hard hat tilted back, sleeves rolled, calloused hands sketching strength into the air. A century-old column waited under his touch. "Look here," he told the apprentices circling him. "The paint looks fine, the surface looks solid, but what matters isn't what your eyes believe, it's what the weight tells you." He guided a nervous kid, barely 20, to strike the column with a mallet. The hollow note that rang out was a truth the eye had missed. Mason explained how to listen for weakness, how to feel where time and pressure had been quietly eroding. "Paint hides rot," he said, voice steady, carrying over the noise. "Polish hides cracks. Don't trust appearances. A building survives only if its bones are sound." The words floated outward, but his mind pulled inward, to Elena's smile the night before, too quick, too rehearsed. To the faint cologne clinging to her blouse, the purse set down as if silence could protect it. To the wince she smothered when she lifted a glass. He adjusted his tool belt, steadying himself. Structures weren't the only things that lied. People could too, sometimes to shield, sometimes to conceal, sometimes because the truth threatened to topple everything. By noon, the crew scattered for lunch. Mason stepped aside, phone buzzing. Elena's text lit the screen, audit crunch. "Late again, don't wait up, third time in a week." The words felt functional, mechanical, not the Elena who once laced her messages with quick jokes and warmth. This one read like an invoice, numbers and duty, no trace of her voice. He typed a reply, then erased it. Instead, he snapped a photo, sunlight spilling across weathered brick, copper gleaming where restoration had stripped away soot. He sent it with one simple line, "Thought you'd like this view." Her answer came minutes later, just a single word, "Nice." 4 letters that weighed more than silence, a gulf inside a single syllable. Mason pocketed the phone, jaw hardening. He walked back to the column and rapped it with his knuckles. The hollow thud answered him like an echo from his own thoughts. He knew the rhythm too well, weakness behind a polished front. His lips moved before he realized. Load-bearing lies. That evening, driving home, the phrase stayed with him. He thought of beams that didn't fail in spectacle. They sagged slowly, quietly, millimeter by millimeter, until the weight they carried exceeded the faith placed on them. Marriage, he realized, could fracture in the same silence. Strain measured in ounces until it cracked like stone under tons. Elena's absence at dinner was explained by deadlines and audits, by the machinery of corporate necessity. But Mason felt the heavier truth pressing down. Something unseen was shifting in the frame. He wondered how long a structure could carry invisible stress before daylight forced the truth into view. By Wednesday evening, Mason had almost convinced himself his doubts were tricks of fatigue. Elena texted again, "Working late, don't wait up." He told himself it was audit season, numbers piling high. He told himself he was overthinking, but denial has its own sound, like plaster straining before it gives. As he pulled into the driveway, Mrs. Delgado, their elderly neighbor, waved him over. Her kind eyes held unease. "I saw Elena last night," she said gently. She looked rattled, walking fast, not her usual calm, and her blouse, it was wrinkled, not like her. Mason thanked her, forced a smile, but the words landed like nails hammered deep. He carried them into the house. When Elena finally came home, it was nearly 10. She dropped her bag on the counter, rubbed her temples, and aimed for the stairs. Mason stepped softly into her path. "Elena," he said, voice low but steady, "let me see your arm." She froze, then laughed too lightly. "What? Why?" "Because you winced the other night, and because Mrs. Delgado noticed you looked shaken, please." Silence stretched. Then with reluctance, she tugged up her sleeve. Mason's breath locked. A bruise sprawled across her forearm, dark, mottled, the distinct shape of fingers gripping too hard. Not a bump, not a stumble, a mark left by another hand. He hovered his hand near it but didn't touch, afraid contact might deepen the wound. His voice dropped to something fragile. "Elena, this isn't from tripping." She yanked the sleeve back down. "I told you I tripped, that's all." The lie rang sharp out of rhythm. Mason knew that rhythm too well. Contractors swearing rotten beams could hold, drywall declared solid while termites hollowed it. This was the same. "Elena," he tried again, gentler. "The bruise says someone grabbed you." Her eyes flicked away, glassy, hiding something, fear, guilt, loyalty tied to the wrong anchor. "I don't want to talk about it," she whispered. The kitchen changed in that moment. Shadows thickened, edges sharpened. What once smelled of late-night coffee and garlic now felt like a stage set for silence. Mason stepped back, giving her space. He didn't press, not tonight, but the bruise carved itself into him undeniable, evidence without words, a truth that would not unwrite itself. Elena disappeared upstairs, leaving her purse half open on the counter. Mason's hands curled into fists, then unclenched. His life had been built on hands that repaired, hands that restored arches, lifted beams, steadied walls. Somewhere else, another man's hands had left violence inked in purple on the woman he loved. And the cruelest part wasn't the bruise itself. It was her willingness to carry it in silence, to shield the man who caused it as if she bore the fault. The fracture widened. The house felt tilted. Mason knew with a clarity as sharp as steel on stone that the truth could not stay hidden much longer. Mason sat in his workshop long after Elena had gone to bed, the bruise on her arm replaying in his mind like a photograph that refused to burn. Tools lay scattered across the bench, wrenches, rulers, levels, objects that usually gave him control. Tonight, they looked like useless relics. Control lived elsewhere now, in an office tower where Victor Hale raised his voice until people bent. Mason turned the thought over and over. If a man left fingerprints on your wife's skin, silence made you complicit. He reached for his phone. For a long moment, he simply stared at the black screen, his own reflection set in a jar of restraint. Then he scrolled, found the number, and pressed call. The line clicked alive. "This is Victor Hale." Mason's voice was steady. "This is Mason Cole, Elena's husband." A pause followed, brief, as if Hale were weighing whether the name mattered. Then his voice slid in, smooth as polished granite, professional and dismissive all at once. "Oh, is everything all right? I want to know what happened in your office," Mason said. "She came home with bruises shaped like fingerprints." Silence stretched heavy. Then Hale laughed, a short, incredulous sound. "You misunderstood. She told you she tripped, didn't she? That's all." Mason didn't reply. He let the silence widen until Hale filled it with condescension. "Look, Cole, workplace stress can get heated. Maybe I raised my voice. Maybe I touched her arm to get her attention. It's nothing. You construction types bruise easier than you think." Mason's grip tightened on the phone. His tone, however, stayed level. "She's not lumber. You don't get to manhandle her." That's when Hale's tone shifted, mockery seeping in, arrogance dressed as amusement. "And if I did grab her, what then? What are you going to do about it?" The words landed like a dare. Mason's chest went cold. It wasn't just the violence, it was the certainty that he was untouchable. "You'll regret saying that," Mason said quietly. Hale chuckled, low and cruel. "Threats. Careful, Cole. Men in my position don't scare. Sleep it off." The line went dead. Mason lowered the phone slowly, eyes fixed on the wall where years of measurements and pencil marks mapped other battles with wood and stone. This battle would not be won with blueprints. Upstairs, Elena stirred as he entered the bedroom. "Who were you talking to?" she asked, voice still fogged with sleep. "Your boss," Mason answered, sitting on the edge of the bed, back rigid. "Pack a bag tomorrow. Stay with your sister." Her eyes flew open. "Mason, please don't make this worse. I'm not shouting, I'm not storming into his office, but I won't let you sleep here with that bruise on your arm and his name still in your mouth. Go to your sister's, let me handle this." She wanted to argue, but the weight in his voice left no space. Tears gathered, unshed. She nodded faintly. When the house fell quiet again, Mason lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Hale thought he was untouchable above consequence. But Mason wasn't planning fists or shattered glass. He was going to build something sharper, consequences as deliberate as scaffolding, precise enough to bring the man down without bringing everything else down with him. At Union Station the next morning, the hall still slept under scaffolding. Mason arrived before dawn, coffee cooling, untouched on a folding table. Blueprints sprawled across the surface, but his pencil sketched lines no architect would understand. He was not diagramming arches and spans. He was diagramming a man, Victor Hale. He drew 4 columns: client trust, licensure, board prestige, time. These were Hale's supports, the beams that held up his reputation. Mason had seen the man at firm dinners, shaking hands with charm, masking contempt. He remembered the way Hale's smile collapsed when he thought no one was watching. Everything Hale built rested on the illusion of being untouchable. Mason wrote under client trust, dependent on appearance of professionalism. If that cracked, contracts would vanish. Licensure regulated by the state board, vulnerable to misconduct claims. Board prestige, influence derived from an image of ethics. Strip away respect, the facade falls. Time, a bottleneck of his own making. Hale signed every check, approved every file, micromanaged every detail. Remove him from flow and the machine froze. The sketch was spare, but the message was heavy. Mason wasn't planning chaos, he was planning consequences. He added 3 levers across the page: legal, civil, reputational, each one capable of shifting weight without splintering innocent beams. Elena's co-workers weren't his target. Hale was. Legal meant documented complaints, corroborated evidence, the kind HR couldn't bury. Civil meant lawsuits, settlements, damages if every other avenue failed. Reputational meant press coverage, professional whispers, board inquiries. Every lever required timing. Too early and it would ring false. Too late and collapse might already be underway. He had learned patience from old stone, the way a cathedral waited centuries to lean. Mason looked up at the half-lit hall around him. Dust motes hung in shafts of sun, the sound of silence heavier than hammers. He thought about scaffolding. You never ripped a wall apart with fury. You tested, braced, supported, then shifted weight until the structure surrendered. He underlined 3 words on the blueprint: consequences, not chaos. For hours he mapped fail-safes. If Hale retaliated against Elena, Mason would have protective complaints ready. If clients ignored rumors, he would escalate to the board. If the press called too soon, he would hold them back until the evidence was airtight. By the time the crew arrived, he rolled up the papers. To anyone else, it looked like restoration math, arches, and supports. But in his mind, he had measured another structure entirely. The hollow man who thought bruises faded into nothing. Mason knew better. What hands left behind did not disappear. They left marks that demanded an answer, and he was going to make sure Victor Hale answered. Mason knew buildings did not collapse from shouting. They fell when weight accumulated, layer upon layer, until denial cracked under its own load. That was how he would handle Victor Hale. No theatrics, no fists, quiet work that left a trail too heavy to erase. He started with time. Elena's texts told fragments: working late, don't wait up. At first, he accepted them as audit season's toll, but now he asked for the exact timestamps gently, never pressing too hard. Paired with her work calendar, they revealed a pattern: late nights coinciding with Hale's private meetings. Next, he mapped movements. The building at Hale and Benton required keycard access. Mason called in a favor from an old friend in IT who reached out to a sympathetic security guard. Logs appeared, entries at dawn, exits near midnight, too many times in 2 weeks to pass as routine. Elevator cameras were harder. Mason couldn't request footage directly, but Elena mentioned a ride where Hale cornered her over the Morrison account. Mason noted it down, subpoena-worthy if escalation demanded it. He gathered artifacts others overlooked: sign-in sheets at reception, time-stamped emails Hale sent long past midnight, Elena's edits on client files marked by digital footprints. Piece by piece, the lattice grew, a scaffold of evidence pointing toward pressure, proximity, escalation. The bruise required record too. Elena resisted at first. I don't want photographs floating around, I don't want to relive it. I understand, Mason said softly. But memory fades, paper doesn't. We need proof, something more permanent than silence, not for the world, for us, for you. Together they visited a physician Mason trusted, a man who had patched him up after a scaffold collapse years ago. The doctor studied Elena's forearm, noted the contusion pattern, and wrote in sterile but damning language, 5 distinct markings consistent with digital compression. Unlikely result of accidental fall. Clinical words, yet undeniable. Mason filed the note into a folder already thickening. Then he asked Elena for one more thing, her own record. a diary entry written while the details were sharp. Not for a courtroom, not for HR, for the truth as you lived it, he told her. She hesitated, then wrote. Her handwriting shook as she described the office. Hale's raised voice, the grip, the apology she accepted out of fear. She ended with a line that hollowed Mason's chest. I lied to my husband because silence felt safer than truth. He placed the page into a sealed envelope marked with date and time, stored alongside the physician's note, the logs, the texts. Off the record, he found counsel too. An HR manager he once repaired a roof for agreed to coffee. Off-duty, she explained how policy treated assault. Documentation, escalation, outside investigator. Most cases falter because there's no trail, she warned. But if you have timestamps, medical notes, and a statement, you already hold more than most. Mason listened, speaking little. He left with one conclusion: Hale's confidence lived in the gaps between evidence. Mason was sealing every gap shut. That night, while Elena slept, Mason spread the documents across his workbench. No headlines, no shouting, just quiet proof, lines of ink and paper heavy enough to bend steel. And when steel bends, collapse is inevitable. Mason believed in hammers, levels, and blueprints, the tools that gave weight to his hands. But some structures could not be measured in timber and stone. Before he made anything public, before consequences grew teeth, he needed guidance from people who understood collapse not in buildings, but in law and survival. The first was Judge Robert Harlan, long retired, but still sharp as chisels honed on stone. Mason had met him years ago through a veteran's apprenticeship program. Harlan was known for mentoring tradesmen who stumbled into disputes with unions, contractors, city boards. Mason dialed his number on a Thursday evening. The judge's voice came warm but edged with curiosity. Bring whatever you've got, Harlan said. Tomorrow, we'll see what holds. In the judge's modest study, walls heavy with books and dust, Mason spread his file, timestamps, keycard logs, physician's note, Elena's sealed diary entry. Harlan studied each piece slowly, glasses perched low. The silence stretched as though the weight of words had to be tested like beams under pressure. Finally, he set his glasses aside. You've got more than most plaintiffs ever bring, he said. Legally, you can go to HR or to the state board if they stall. If Hale retaliates, you've got grounds for a civil claim. But listen, his eyes narrowed. The law is slow, it grinds. Men like Hale bet on that. They think time works for them. Mason nodded. I can't let time be his shield. Then build a case tight enough no board can ignore. Patience and precision, that's how you win. The second gatekeeper was Lee Tran, director of a women in finance advocacy group. Mason found her through a quiet recommendation from his HR contact. They met at a downtown cafe, Lee's laptop covered in stickers, her expression carrying equal parts warmth and fire. Mason told her everything, the grip on Elena's arm, the arrogance in Hale's voice, the bruise shaped like ownership. Lee didn't flinch. She'd heard worse. When Mason finished, she leaned forward. Here's what you need to understand. Safety comes first, before complaints, before exposure. Confidentiality agreements can be weapons. Retaliation is real if you go public too fast. Elena pays the cost. Mason clenched his jaw. She's already paying. Then we reduce the cost, Lee said firmly. File through channels that guarantee anonymity at first. Document every incident. Build allies inside the firm, other staff who have seen his behavior. Patterns matter. They strip away the idea of misunderstanding. For over an hour, Lee laid out a map. How to safeguard copies of evidence, how to prioritize complaints, which lawyers specialized in advocacy, which hotlines protected whistleblowers. Mason listened, committing every note to memory. By nightfall, his strategy had grown new columns, legal from Harlan, safety from Lee. Together, they stood beside the scaffolding he'd already begun. Mason returned home with a card in his pocket, numbers inked onto paper that felt heavier than steel. That night, he refined his plan. Two voices now echoed alongside his own, law and advocacy, teaching him that vengeance alone collapsed structures too violently. What he wanted was proportion. Enough force to bring Hale down, not enough to bury others in the rubble. On his workshop wall, beside blueprints of Union Station, he pinned a second diagram. One blueprint was timber and steel. The other was justice in progress. Both required the same discipline, patience, precision, and the will to see them finished. Mason knew words could be hammers if placed right. Not shouted in anger, but set down in black ink, measured, factual, permanent. That was his next step. He cleared his workbench. Tools gave way to a laptop, a printer, a folder of evidence. The lamp cast a circle of light as if he were drafting blueprints, but what appeared on the page was heavier than timber or steel. The first letter went to the managing committee of Hale and Benton. Mason wrote in formal cadence, "I am writing to notify you of an incident involving senior partner Victor Hale and my wife, Elena Park. No dramatics, no adjectives, just facts. The bruise, the physician's note, the timestamps, the diary entry." He cited the firm's own employee handbook, page and paragraph. He reminded them of their duty under state labor codes to provide a safe environment. And then the line that mattered most, should internal remedies fail, we are prepared to engage outside counsel. The second letter went to the firm's malpractice insurer. Mason attached the physician's note, not the photograph, but enough to imply negligence in supervision. Insurers feared liability more than scandal. His phrasing was clinical. Failure to act may constitute breach of duty by senior management. The third letter addressed the state bar's ethics division. Mason didn't accuse, he reported. There is credible evidence suggesting conduct by a licensed attorney that may violate ethical rules regarding workplace safety and professional integrity. He included copies of Elena's statement and the medical note, reserving originals for sealed submission. By midnight, the envelope sat in neat rows, stamped and dated. Digital copies waited in encrypted accounts Lee had helped him set up. Every message was time-stamped, archived, and backed up in cloud storage beyond Hale's reach. Mason kept the tone constant, measured, factual, cold as steel. He never wrote angry, he wrote documented. He never wrote outraged, he wrote corroborated, words sharpened not by fury but by law. At the close of every letter, he added the same request, interim protections. Until this matter is resolved, MS, Park, and other employees should be shielded from direct contact with Mr. Hale. Practical, humane, enforceable. When the last envelope was sealed, Mason leaned back. There was no triumph, only the quiet recognition that something irreversible had begun. Hale might sneer over the phone, but paper carried its own kind of weight. Once the right people received it, silence could no longer protect him. The next morning, Mason carried the stack to the post office. He slid them into the chute, listening for the sound as they dropped. To anyone else, it was just paper falling. To Mason, it was steel bolts locking into place. Not chaos, not noise, pressure applied with precision. And pressure, when sustained, always moved stone. Mason understood that in both construction and conflict, timing was as critical as force. You never pulled a support beam without shoring its load. You didn't let pressure bleed all at once. You applied it in intervals, deliberate and measured, until the whole frame sagged under its own weight. So he staggered his actions across the week. Monday morning, the managing committee received his letter. Tuesday, the malpractice carrier. Wednesday, the state bar. Each wave landed like a tide, giving the firm no time to recover before the next surge arrived. Every delivery left a time-stamped trail. Emails queued at precise intervals, hard copies shipped by overnight courier. If anyone tried to claim ignorance, Mason could point to the clock. Silence became complicity the moment those stamps existed. Mandatory reporting triggers were next. With Lee Tran's guidance, Mason identified which state agencies were bound to move once an internal complaint alleged physical misconduct. He didn't leak rumors. He didn't whisper at cocktail parties. He filed in the quiet way that left no choice but motion. Bureaucracies might be slow, but they left paper behind, and paper was permanent. Still, Mason knew paper trails weren't enough. Culture mattered. He remembered Judge Harlan's warning, patience and precision. so he reached backward to those who had worked under Hale and left suddenly. LinkedIn messages, quiet introductions, phone calls that began with hesitation. 3 women, 1 man, each spoke of temper, belittling, subtle retaliation. One described being cornered in a file room, Hale's hand slamming the cabinet beside her head. Another admitted she almost filed a complaint, but fear of his connections forced her out instead. Mason didn't ask them to go public. He only asked if they would confirm their experiences if contacted by investigators. Each voice added weight, not noise. By Friday, his folder had doubled. More logs, more testimony, more quiet accounts waiting for daylight. The committee now held multiple complaints. The insurer whispered about liability. The bar's ethics division acknowledged receipt. Hale still strutted through the office, but the ground beneath him had begun to soften. Mason didn't need headlines. He wanted the right people, the ones with power and jurisdiction, to face a stack of evidence too orderly to dismiss. Document first, pressure later. That weekend, Mason sat at the kitchen table, refining his calendar. Next week, if the committee stalled, he would escalate to a formal licensure inquiry. If the insurer hesitated, he would release corroborated accounts from past employees. Each move had a place. Each strike was calibrated. Late Saturday night, Elena passed through the kitchen. She paused when she saw the growing tower of files, color-coded tabs marking the weeks of their lives. "You've built something," she said softly. Mason looked up. "No, I'm building. The structure isn't finished. But when it stands, it won't fall on us. It will fall on him." Monday morning carried no sound of hammers for Mason, only the silence of waiting. The managing committee of Hale and Benton had called an emergency session. It was Elena's firm, but not her fight to lead. Mason's letters, the logs, the physician's note, and Elena's diary entry were already stacked on polished oak, waiting to speak for themselves. Victor Hale entered first. Silver hair, tailored suit, briefcase clutched too tightly. Once he moved through rooms with ease, his smile polished, his charm convincing. But this morning the edges dulled. The man who once dominated conversation now looked like someone rehearsing a role in the wrong theater. Margaret Kane, the committee chair, opened the session. Her voice carried neither warmth nor malice, only weight. She read excerpts from Mason's letter, workplace violence, duty of care, reporting obligations. Policies spoke, not outrage, not gossip. Elena sat at the far end, hands folded tight in her lap. Margaret turned to her. "Until this matter is resolved, you are granted paid leave. An independent investigator will be appointed. You will have full access to resources and protection from direct supervision by Mr. Hale." Victor bristled. "Absurd, paid leave, investigators, based on what? A bruise and her husband's imagination." Margaret slid a folder across the table. Photographs stared back at him. Elena's forearm marked with 5 dark bruises shaped like fingers. A physician's note accompanied it, pattern consistent with digital compression. Unlikely result of accidental fall. Hale's jaw tightened. Anyone could have caused that. Another sheet followed, keycard logs showing Elena's late-night entries always overlapping with his. Then Mason's sworn statement notarized, describing their phone call. "What if I did? What will you do?" The words clung to the air like smoke. "Out of context," Hale snapped. "I was frustrated, not violent." But silence answered him. Partners shifted in their chairs, eyes lowered. Reverence had thinned into discomfort. His voice, once commanding, now rang hollow against the stillness. He slammed his palm on the table. "This is my firm. I built it. You'll throw me out over one bruise and a story." Margaret's voice cut through, calm and precise. "No, Victor. We will hold you accountable because the evidence compels us. Because ignoring it makes us complicit. This firm survives on trust, and you have fractured it." For the first time, Hale's voice cracked. He demanded loyalty, demanded someone defend him, but no one moved. Partners stared at their hands. Associates whispered at the back of the room. His armor of charm had rusted, and everyone could hear the hollow beneath. Downstairs in the lobby, Elena stepped out of the elevator. Mason was waiting. When she saw him, her shoulders dropped a fraction, as if air had finally returned to her lungs. She didn't need to describe the vote or the folder. The look on her face told him enough. The ground had shifted. Upstairs, Hale remained in the boardroom, raging at the silence. But Mason knew, once a structure sounded hollow, no one could unhear it. Collapse was only a matter of time. The committee had not yet voted Hale out, but the interim measures cut deeper than he expected. Effective immediately, his authority was suspended. He could no longer assign cases, approve overtime, or manage direct reports. His access to sensitive files was restricted, his emails routed through filters that marked every word he typed. The memo circulated before noon. HR phrased it carefully. Resources are available to any employee experiencing workplace hostility. Confidential channels remain open. No names were given, but every desk knew. Reverence, once mistaken for respect, thinned into silence. 2 days later, the first clients froze their accounts. The Morrison Group postponed their engagement until the investigation concluded. A regional bank followed, citing prudence in uncertain times. These were not minor contracts. They were lifelines. Partners whispered in corridors, calculators clicking behind their eyes, already tallying loss. Hale felt oxygen drain from the polished image he had curated for decades. The smile that once commanded rooms now looked like ill-fitting armor. Associates avoided his gaze. Receptionists routed his calls with cold efficiency. The man who once thrived on control found every lever welded shut. That night, Mason's phone rang. The number glowed familiar. Against instinct, he answered. "Mason," Hale began, voice brittle. "We need to talk." Mason said nothing. Silence pressed until Hale rushed to fill it. "This has gone too far. The committee's panicking. Clients are spooked. You and we can resolve this privately. Tell me what you want, money, an apology, my assurance it won't happen again." Mason's tone stayed steady. "You still don't understand. This isn't about bargaining in the dark." Hale's voice sharpened. "You think you can destroy me? I built this firm. I have judges, bankers, regulators in my corner. You'll regret dragging me into mud." Mason exhaled slowly, like measuring before driving a nail. "Accountability doesn't live in back rooms, Victor. It lives in daylight. It lives in records that don't disappear." On the other end, Hale's breath faltered. For the first time, Mason heard something underneath the arrogance, fear. "You'll regret this," Hale muttered, but the threat landed weak. He hung up without waiting for reply. Mason lowered the phone onto his workbench beside blueprints and evidence folders. He thought about how structures failed, not with a bang, but in steps. First the groan, then the shift of weight, then the visible sag. Victor Hale had already lost the first beams. Mason knew more would follow. The firm moved quickly. Within a week, the committee brought in an outside investigator. No half measures, no internal politics. Her name was Dana Rios, known in state agencies and corporate halls alike. She carried no flash, no charm, only a reputation for memory sharp as glass and questions sharper still. Elena sat across from her in a glass-walled conference room, Denver's skyline stretching behind her like a silent jury. Mason had walked her through what to expect. The silences, the temptation to soften, the danger of exaggeration. Lee Tran had coached her too. Don't minimize, don't inflate, just tell it the way you lived it. For the first time, Elena held her truth without reshaping it to protect anyone else. Her voice stayed calm. She spoke of late nights demanded by Hale, of files he made her recheck alone, of his voice swelling until it filled the office. She described the night his hand clamped her arm, the bruise that bloomed, the apology that came too quick and too shallow. She mentioned Mason's quiet observation at home, how he had seen what she tried to bury. She did not dramatize, she did not excuse. She laid bricks of truth one by one. Dana asked for times, exact words, who might have seen her leave. Elena answered carefully, steady, like a builder aligning stone. When asked about retaliation, she admitted she had feared not the job, but her reputation, the years she had invested, the fragile respect she thought silence might preserve. "I told myself silence would protect me," she said, but silence only protected him. Outside the glass, Mason waited. He sat in the corridor with a thermos of chamomile tea he knew she liked, more gesture than necessity. He did not pace. He held himself steady, hands folded, a quiet presence anchoring her through walls of glass and steel. Staff passed now and then, some with nods of sympathy, some with eyes turned away. Mason let them pass. His job was not to speak. His job was to be there. After nearly 2 hours, the door opened. Elena stepped out. Her shoulders were straighter than when she had entered. Dana followed, folder closed with a snap. "Thank you," the investigator said. "Your clarity will help us move forward." Elena accepted the tea Mason offered. She sipped, then leaned against the wall, her voice soft. "I thought I'd shake, but I didn't." "That's because you told it the way it happened," Mason said. "Nothing more, nothing less." For the first time in weeks, Elena breathed without weight pressing her lungs. The bruise on her arm had faded to yellow and green, but the act of speaking left a mark deeper than any injury. Not pain. Proof. Mason walked beside her down the long corridor toward the lobby. Their footsteps echoed together, carrying them toward air and light. He didn't mention strategy or hail or next moves. Some silences didn't need filling. Some silences were stronger than steel beams, carrying weight so Elena didn't have to. The investigation concluded faster than anyone expected. Less than 3 weeks after Dana Rios began, her report landed on the mahogany table of Hale and Benton's managing committee. Its weight was not in pages, but in precision. Her findings were blunt. A corroborated pattern of physical intimidation. Multiple employees testified to Hale slamming desks, cornering staff, raising his voice until they shrank back. Retaliatory comments, subtle threats woven into emails and reviews. The bruise on Elena's arm was no longer isolated. It was a piece of a broader design, a man who used fear as punctuation. The recommendations section cut deeper: leadership removal, mandatory ethics training across the firm, appointment of a third-party monitor, a public apology, referral of Victor Hale to the State Bar's disciplinary board. Silence filled the room as Margaret Kane read each line aloud. The Denver skyline gleamed beyond floor-to-ceiling windows, but no one looked outward. The walls themselves seemed to lean in. Victor Hale broke first. "This is character assassination," he snapped. "You're letting one woman's bruise destroy everything we built." Margaret corrected him, her voice steady as steel. "Not one woman, Victor. 4 employees corroborated intimidation. 3 saved your emails, and you admitted on record to laying hands on MS. Park. This is not assassination. This is accountability." Hale's eyes darted from partner to partner, searching for loyalty. Once allies would have nodded, chuckled at his anger, closed ranks. Now they shifted uncomfortably, eyes down, lips tight. His circle had shrunk to silence, less loyalty, more survival. "The board won't accept this." He tried again, desperation leaking through his tone. Margaret's reply was measured. "The board has already been informed. They await our formal vote." The stillness that followed was louder than Hale's protests. One by one hands rose: removal, monitoring, referral. The tally wasn't close. Hale's face reddened. "Cowards," he spat. "Every one of you, you'll regret this." But no one answered. The scrape of chairs, the shuffle of papers, the soft click of pens, those were the sounds of a man losing the last of his leverage. Downstairs, Elena stepped out of the elevator into the lobby where Mason waited. He read the truth in her face. Relief mixed with disbelief. The fragile expression of someone who had finally seen a wall crack after years of looking solid. "He's finished," she whispered. Mason only nodded. He wasn't smiling. What he felt wasn't victory. It was something colder, steadier. Justice was not triumph. Justice was correction. The vote had been cast, the findings written, but Victor Hale was not a man who walked out quietly. He returned to the committee room with a lawyer at his side, a stack of papers clutched like a shield. His voice was tight, rehearsed for sympathy. "I've given this firm 20 years, he declared. "If you think I'll leave with nothing, you're mistaken. We can settle this. A soft landing benefits everyone." But the committee had already moved past him. The malpractice carrier had raised alarms. The bar's disciplinary board had requested files. Regulators were circling. Silence could no longer serve as shelter. Margaret Kane folded her hands on the table. Victor, this isn't about a soft landing. It's about certainty. The firm survives only if accountability is complete. That was when Mason's counsel, an employment attorney referred by Lee Tran, stepped forward. Calm, precise, he outlined the non-negotiables. Admission of misconduct. Hale would sign a statement acknowledging intimidation and physical contact. Resignation, effective immediately with no appeal, forfeiture of bonus. Year-end payout withheld, redirected, contribution to a survivor's fund, a monitored account supporting victims of workplace harassment, permanent bar on management. Hale could never again supervise or hold authority in any licensed firm. Hale's lawyer bristled. You're demanding the destruction of his career. Mason's counsel didn't flinch. His actions destroyed it. We're ensuring the rubble doesn't bury others. Victor slammed his hand on the table. You think you can muzzle me? I'll go to the press. Margaret's voice cut like tempered steel. Elena's name stays private unless she chooses otherwise. If you drag her into this, the full file is released. Every log, every note, every sworn statement. The record will speak louder than you ever could. For the first time, Hale faltered. Rage still burned, but the performance sagged under its own weight. His allies had dwindled to silence. His lawyer leaned close, whispering numbers and odds. The walls seemed to close in. At last, he sagged back into his chair, face pale. If I sign this, I'm finished. No, Margaret said softly. If you refuse, you're worse than finished. Investigated, prosecuted, remembered only for the harm. This at least gives you a choice, your signature. The room held its breath. Finally, Hale picked up the pen. His signature scratched across the page, jagged, reluctant. The sound echoed like nails driven into timber, final and irreversible. When the documents were stamped and filed, Hale stood, but his shoulders no longer carried authority. He was just a man leaving the wreckage of his own making. Downstairs, Elena waited. She never saw the papers. Mason didn't show them. All she needed to know was that her silence was no longer his leverage, that her story was hers to control. The firm had cut away the rot, but Mason understood. Removal was not the end. Structures required rebuilding after demolition, and justice, if it was to endure, had to be crafted with the same care as stone and steel. Victor Hale's signature had barely dried before the firm's communications team began drafting language sharp enough to hold under scrutiny. Overnight, edits passed between legal, HR, and compliance. By morning, the announcement appeared on the firm's website and every professional channel tied to its name. It did not mourn Hale's departure. It did not soften his actions into missteps or misunderstandings. It centered the employees. Our firm is committed to a workplace free of intimidation and misconduct. Recent findings revealed conduct by former partner Victor Hale inconsistent with our values and obligations. Effective immediately, he has resigned. An independent monitor will oversee training and reporting procedures. In addition, the firm is launching a survivors fund to support employees across the industry who have faced harassment. The language was clinical, but between the lines, everyone could read what had been broken and what was being repaired. Regulators were notified within hours. The malpractice carrier, fearing exposure, approved funding for the monitor. The state board logged receipt of the full report. What Hale once controlled now moved without him, and in many ways against him. Inside the firm, the effect was immediate. Associates who once walked with hunched shoulders lifted their heads. Paralegals whispered relief in the break room. A current of quiet gratitude rippled through the halls, the sense that someone had finally named what so many had endured in silence. For Elena, the statement was only half the story. The other half came in a sealed envelope delivered to their kitchen table. Inside was a letter signed in Hale's own hand. No euphemisms, no legal filters, just blunt acknowledgement. I gripped your arm in anger. I intimidated staff. I retaliated against those who resisted. My actions were inexcusable. I apologize for the harm I caused you, Elena Park, and for the fear I spread through the workplace. She read it once, then again. Her breath shook, but her hands held steady. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't absolution, but it was proof, the truth named by the man who had tried so hard to bury it. Mason watched her fold the letter back into the envelope. "How does it feel?" he asked quietly. Elena thought for a moment. "Like something heavy slid off me, not gone, but lighter." The press seized the announcement within a day. Headlines spoke of accountability, industry blogs debated culture shifts. Mason ignored the noise. What mattered was Elena walking into her office without scanning over her shoulder. What mattered was breath without fear, laughter without calculation, skin no longer braced for impact. Internally, people called it closure. Mason knew it was something else entirely. Closure sounded like endings. This was construction, not the tearing down, the building back. In the weeks that followed, reporters circled like gulls over a storm's wake. They wanted sound bites, the inside story from the husband who had stared down a senior partner. Mason declined them all. Headlines faded. What mattered was what remained standing when the noise was gone. Elena faced her own crossroads. Firms courted her quickly, eager to polish their reputations by hiring the woman who had endured scandal with composure. But she chose carefully. She picked a smaller practice where partners spoke less of prestige and more of clarity. In interviews, they asked not what had been done to her, but how she had handled it. For once, her worth was measured in her strength, not her silence. Mason returned to Union Station. The scaffolding came down, dust settled. One afternoon, he stood beneath the restored skylight as sunlight poured through glass that once was dulled by grime. The light washed over his face, not as triumph, but as alignment. He did not feel victorious. He felt accurate. Justice, like restoration, was not about glory. It was about correcting what was crooked, reinforcing what was weak, ensuring what mattered could bear weight again. At home, Elena sometimes traced her forearm absent-mindedly. The bruise was gone, her skin pale and smooth once more. But the boundary it had marked remained sharper than ever. She knew what she would never excuse again. She knew silence was not safety. Mason noticed it too in small things. The way she carried herself at her new office, voice steady when pushing back against deadlines. The way her laughter returned on their porch, light again as the Denver skyline faded into night. Some repairs you could point to, the gleaming skylight above commuters, the fresh paint across an old beam. Others you simply lived, invisible but enduring. One evening, as they shared coffee on the porch, Elena asked, "Do you ever wish it had ended differently? Quieter?" Mason shook his head. Quieter would have meant nothing changed. What we keep isn't just the life we had. It's the line we drew. That line stays. The bruise had faded, but the lesson had not. Some marks vanish from skin. Others etch themselves into choices, into resolve, into the architecture of who you become after the fracture. As the city lights blinked on, Mason thought of the blueprint pinned above his workbench. The one not for a station or courthouse, but for consequences. He no longer needed it. The structure had held. The lesson was built. And in that quiet, he understood. The most important repairs aren't the ones others admire. They are the ones that let you live without fear the roof above you might give way. And that brings us to the end of He Bruised My Wife. I rewrote the rules and made consequences last. In the end, bruises may fade, but the boundaries we draw remain. Betrayal always carries a price, and silence can no longer protect the guilty. If you were in Mason's place, would you have chosen the same path, or would you have sought a different kind of justice? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching Cheating Stories 7. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your opinions. Your voice keeps this community alive. Until next time, take care and stay strong.